Alright, we're back with more college football coverage, and in this one, we have an update in the Sherrone Moore trial. To this point, there has been a lot of different unravelings within the confines of this particular case. Most recently, to briefly summarize my last video, the judge, J. Cedric Simpson, found that there was the potential of due process rights being violated as a result of an obviation and lack of admission of the fact that there was an employee-employer relationship between Sherrone Moore and the victim in question throughout this case that led to his initial arrest. At the time of it, as I stated in that video, you're going to have at least one person representing the entire police department expressing what might have occurred over the course of it and all of the background information that they at least have access to in the moment to discuss in their report. She left that fact out, the officer in question, and as a result, one tiny, seemingly mistake in that sense, right, has now brought things to a situation where on March 4th, they would need to revisit the entire scope of this original arrest. Because everything from that point forward was put into question. You have that taking place. A brutal error when you really think about it. Because that is the law, not just on the state level, but also written in the Constitution. And again, that brings together a massive implication if that's found to be the case. You also have to understand that at this point, from what was originally slated to happen, the way in which different things were expressed throughout the arrest and all of the aftermath, compared to now having all of that completely thrown into a shadow of legal proportions, it is not a good time at all. At all. They thought they had all the momentum going, and just like that, all of that progress could be thrown out of the window if certain things are discovered throughout this. But on top of that, they still needed to come back to the court on March 4th with more clarity on different events, more clarity on the scale of the relationship, to truly see in, legal terms if everything matched up in terms of what the definition of that relationship would entail in court and how things were going in real life with some of the initial evidence, like the text messages that the two had on December 9th and 10th for reference, and just general documentation related to Title IX from the university and other sources to try to gain as much new information as possible, as much context as possible that was not initially provided in this overall thing in the first place. And with that going down on March 4th, there would be an update. Now, it took me a little bit of time to get into it on my own time and look into everything, but when I would come across it and as I would read it, yeah, major opportunity for Sherrone Moore to truly get himself out of a jam. And not just any jam. Again, like, the narrative around the man is still up in the air to this point, as I have to continue to reiterate, because with the way that it's been covered, it's not like the internet is just going to forget, unfortunately, that something like this happened. And maybe they shouldn't. But at the same time, compared to him dealing with potential felony charges into what things would turn out to be after this hearing, is definitely another step in the right direction for him. As this article from the Detroit News would state, quote, Former University of Michigan football coach Sherrone Moore on Friday avoided a possible 5-year prison sentence by pleading no contest to 2 misdemeanor charges for barging into the apartment of his executive assistant with whom he had a relationship, while 3 other charges were dismissed. Appearing in Ann Arbor's 14A District Court, Moore said nothing in court or outside of it other than to enter his no contest plea on the record. He faces up to 6 months in jail for a trespassing charge and a malicious use of a telecommunications device charge, the more serious of the 2 misdemeanors. He is scheduled to be sentenced at 2 p.m. on April 14th. So I noted that date down because that will decide his true fate there. Of course, we can't guarantee that he'd get that time in prison right now, and I'll make that point later on as well, but 6 months potentially compared to damn near 5 years and over. That is just, there are absolutely levels to that entire thing. So it's definitely a major win on the legal side of things for Moore and his team, also the lawyer and Ellen Michaels representing him. It's like when you look at the initial charges, you had felony home invasion, you had felony breaking and entering, and another felony charge in terms of that alleged threat that he had on himself and also the victim in question. All those things could have resulted in numerous years in prison for a man who, again, had just literally been leading one of the most prestigious college football programs of all time, who still got a family at home to take care of, who still got a wife at home to be alongside. And the entire atmosphere could have changed for him if he were to be cast into that specific area to where he's not even able to do much of anything in a situation where most of his rights, if not all of his rights, are just completely stripped away in a barren setting where he's not insured to even be protected as an individual due to just, again, the language, the tone of that initial report and what had happened. It casts Sherrone Moore out to be a person who might have been deserving of such sentencing, if not for the fact that upon double checking it, triple checking it, they believed that certain things in that report didn't add up. They believed that certain tendencies within that overall arrest and the way in which different things were expressed about this relationship just did not add up to what exactly was being presented in court. Luckily for them, they were able to counter it, find the proper avenues to approach, and come up with the right documentation to present to the court and actually satisfy the requirements that J. Cedric Simpson threw out the first time. Like, that just cannot go understated at all. Like, yes, as this quote from the Detroit News states, if he were to have been convicted of home invasion, the most serious of the 3 charges, Moore could have faced up to 5 years in prison, end quote. And that's just for the lone charge. That's not mentioning the other felony charges that he had dealt with at that time that were placed on his profile at that point after his booking initially in jail for 2 days. It's just, it's wild to, again, not even be a person really into the realm of law and still see that in an industry like that, you have got to make sure that everything is lined up properly. Because all it takes is one fatal flaw in your argument, and there are going to be other skilled lawyers and judges who have all the expertise to come after that and provide an attack against those claims if they see fit. That appeared to be the case here. Let me see. It's, again, a situation where anytime you're entering a plea deal, it's not necessarily an admission of guilt, and it's not necessarily an admission of absolute innocence either. It always lands somewhere in the middle. The goal for Michaels and Moore, as she even stated numerous times in the last update on this case, the goal was to always move on from this as quickly as possible. Not having to worry about enduring the long process of a longer trial and having to bear witness to all of this alleged slander, as Michaels had been putting it, with inconclusive evidence and potentially slanted argumentation, with the way that, again, they believed on their side that the report was framed to, again, make Sherrone Moore look like this deranged individual without really placing any insight on the overall representation of both parties in the situation. And that is where we get into what happened with the victim herself in this situation. Because for quite a while, for obvious reasons, the name of the victim hadn't really been put out in the public eye for quite some time. And rarely did you hear anything come directly from her as an individual. Because if these things were going down, again, as you know, I'm thinking about in previous videos on this, and as I'm speculating, if things were made out to be true, well, it's not like it's going to be made easy for this person to just come right out and reveal her identity in a high-stakes case like this. However, with everything that is now come into play, it's almost like at that point, with you seemingly being on the losing end of this case now, with it appearing as though Moore can get off somewhat scot-free, although again, as I said and echoed in the first one, still doesn't make it to where anyone is going to be unscathed as a result of this overall thing. But he may not get any jail time at all. And so, on that side, you are trying to do everything in your power to sway the jury back over to you as a sort of last-ditch effort to gain some sort of support. And, you know, maybe acquire a couple voters on your end as well to swing the pendulum just a little bit, just enough to force a prolonged process. And that's where I think that this statement came in. But we would get one from the victim herself. According to a quote from the Detroit News, this overall statement comes from the victim herself, and we have a name for it, which I can uncover in a second. Quote, "Our client was forced to endure years of manipulation, harassment, exploitation by a man who held enormous power over her professional life as the head football coach of one of the nation's most prominent college football programs," the statement said. "The power imbalance between a powerful head coach and a subordinate employee created an environment where our client felt pressured, intimidated, and unable to escape conduct that should never occur in any workplace, let alone at a public university. Institutions entrusted with the education and safety of students and employees have a fundamental duty to ensure that power is never used to exploit or silence others. A thorough and transparent investigation into this conduct and any related institutional failures must occur. Our client came forward at tremendous personal cost because she believes that silence allows abuse of power to continue. End quote. And all of that comes from Paige Shiver, the executive assistant to Sherrone Moore at the University of Michigan, who has been implicated as such throughout this entire case. And again, if these things were made to be true, then you would have to understand on her end how much of a struggle that could be to come forward. The strength, the brevity of some of those allegations make it seem like, again, she was truly subdued and held in this oppressive state to where there wasn't really any room for her to do much of anything. And when you look at how some of the things were defined on the university's end, the way that some of their policies worked when she still had her job at this point, because as I read in a different article here, one of them mentioned that essentially she'd been let go in February. So she doesn't hold this position anymore, but while she was still there, she was not initially fired when Moore was, because again, with the dynamic of that relationship between the employer and the employee, the university policy essentially stated that, hey, because she came forward on the second go round and served as the employee in this relationship without really having the same kind of power on nearly the same level and control potentially that Sherrone Moore did in this case, she was not implicated on much of anything, and all of the responsibility was going to fall on him to eventually come forward because she got ahead of the process. Moore was the one that would be fired as a result of that misconduct. So that's why she still held that position. But even then, you can ensure that with the constant media pressure surrounding this case, whether or not things have been made out to be true or not, that is definitely a lot to absorb. Especially when, again, taking some of those allegations into consideration, your entire life was in danger. Your way of living was in danger to the point where, again, I'm believing that she was going back to her house that night before Moore allegedly barged in, per multiple reports, to potentially just skip town, and that's what these initial reports said. I'm thinking that she's probably trying to move to a different state or a completely different jurisdiction to make sure that Moore is out of reach and doesn't have any knowledge of where exactly she might be headed at that time, if she truly felt away. This statement would come through per her attorneys, which are Andrew M. Stroth and Stephen A. Hart. So, not still willing to really put herself out there like that, but her attorneys are, representing her as spokespeople. I mean, the statement definitely makes a good point about a few things here, and honestly, when it comes to everything that's university related in this statement, I have my own insights on that later on, but yeah, she's right. The attorneys also made it a point to allege that, quote, she might not be the only person who experienced inappropriate, coercive, or predatory behavior from Moore and called on the university to investigate, end quote. As I'll reiterate later, and as I've already quoted from several different sources in previous videos about this case, this is far from the first incident that Michigan and their athletics department specifically has dealt with relating to potential harassment and inappropriate misconduct in employee-employer relationships this decade. This is far from the first. There have been some that have gone to even more extreme lengths. that still have yet to be completely determined at this point. So, could this be something that is true? We don't know right now. It's not completely out of the realm of the possibility, though, given just how much bullshit has gone on through there already. It's ridiculous. It's like there's no way that something like that can happen. But you say all that to say that even when it came down to them reducing the weight of some of these charges and the overall weight of a potential sentence, it seems like there was a general consensus as to the direction that this was taking. First, from the judge, you have him stating overall, because to take this whole thing into account, quote, "The deal followed the judge's assertion last month in court that he was very worried that the relationship between Moore and his ex-assistant was not disclosed when an arrest warrant was sought. But he said he was satisfied with the charges placed before him on Friday. The court reviewed the Pittsfield Township Police report, and the court does find that there's a sufficient factual basis in which the court could determine defendant's guilt of these two offenses, which were the trespassing and malicious use of a telephone," end quote, Simpson said. So, when you have that being made clear now, understanding that there is now a direction that can be taken in this that makes sense for all parties involved, it makes the decision making a little bit easier on everybody at that point. And you even had outside sources, praising the work of Ellen Michaels, as this would go on to say. Like, damn, okay. You also have Rizmersky in this situation, the attorney who, and I guess DA rather, who brought out a lot of the different allegations, especially when it came to the alleged breaking and entering, and the quotes in which were exchanged in terms of dialogue between the person whom Shiver, the victim, was calling at that time, along with Sherrone Moore in that situation upon allegedly barging in. On her end, she said, quote, "We have arrived at that based on a thorough review of the additional involved evidence and investigation, as well as after consultation with, pursuant to our Obligation of Crime Victim Rights Act, consultation with the victim, largely through our representatives in this matter," Rizmersky said, noting that there has never been enough evidence to prove or issue charges based on allegations of domestic violence against Moore. "What we do believe the evidence supports is criminal misbehavior in the context of an intimate partner relationship," she added, end quote. And when you really think about it that way, yes, you can give her credit for having all of that turnaround, but at the same time, it's just a tough thing to admit, because on her end, you're serving on, I think she is, well, in this situation, it's like you're trying so hard to make sure that things stick. And to be honest, Rizmersky in this situation, it's not really, it's tricky. There are many people that are going to be working under her and above her in this situation. There's a general trust lying within somewhere that these people are handling their job at every single level. She may have entered this case thinking that she had really good evidence on her hands and did everything in her power to ensure that all of these different elements of this case lined up to absolute perfection. She can't control one of the police members or officers in that arrest going out in the police report and failing to provide all the facts. that is just, again, a wrench in the overall plan. And it's not something that she might have been counting on in that situation, fortunately. Now you have to pivot. Now you have to try to play ball. From the legal and logistical standpoint, you don't have much of a choice. Especially if they continue to find these discrepancies. Because it just makes the statement look incredibly weaker with time. So you don't have much of a choice in that situation. When you really look back and think about it, the way that original report was framed, looking at it within the confines of what was just said here in terms of, it not having enough evidence at that point to prove that there was domestic violence on Moore's end ever in this relationship. Some of that stuff might have been a little fantastical. And again, that plays into the idea of the timing and the scope of this original report being very suspicious to Simpson in the first place. Like, yes, it sounds like this was a truly toxic ending to the relationship, seemingly. But on the one end, if you're gonna have these text messages out here with Moore still trying to, check on a few things logistically with Shiver at this time because of the fact that they are still on the job together. And that, as Simpson said multiple times, there could be a reasoning. Michaels as well, there could be a reason why these messages are still happening. It doesn't make it to where Moore is necessarily trying to, have any malintent with this. He might just simply be doing his job. So you have those messages come into question with it. And then you also consider, again, you don't really get hard facts on any domestic violence whatsoever. A lot of it was really created to spark emotion in people. And at the time, it worked. But when you had to dial it back, dissect it over time, without that truly damning evidence, there was almost no way you could get something like this done without a smoking gun. You couldn't. These are massive allegations to be thrown out. Again, a plea could still mean that some of this stuff may have happened. So that is something that we may just never know. But you best be as tactical as possible with acquiring the information. Otherwise, they can't give those allegations as much merit as one would expect. It's difficult in those situations. It truly is. Right, as this quote says, from a different outside source, as I've been iterating throughout this entire time, the no contest plea is translated simply as, I don't want to fight this, I don't want to contest it, but I'm not admitting that I did anything wrong, let alone illegal, according to Art Weiss, a Farmington Hills-based attorney. So that's really what it boils down to. Like, sure, it still is a situation that will carry on for quite some time, with all the aftermath that's come out about it between people making videos on it and also just being completely ignorant in some cases as well, trying to pile on about it when, this is stuff to be taken seriously. But I digress. Yeah, let me see. Right. And yeah. Even more layers to this thing. Because if you thought that... Man, oh man, oh man. Right. As this just says for backstory, like it was just the second that something like this happened, because the police detective that did this was Jessica Welker of the Pittsfield Township Police Department. Again, she in this situation as well is definitely a person who is right now, I don't know what the hell she may be going through at this point. Because again, you think that you're doing your job in this situation. You think you're handling each and every single one of your responsibilities in this situation. And maybe that's fair, but that is a critical mistake to have. You see it in any police report, in any presser related to, any position of government or a specific borough, police force, etc. You have to have all your facts straight, and you've got to line it up for people. Not incorporating a vital piece of evidence in that line of work is almost like lying. It's damn near like it. In fact, it might be far worse. And there are severe implications for it. In those other professions that might be even more extreme than police work, like I'm pretty sure you can get penalized, arrested, and banned for certain things as a result of failing to admit work. Think about how many people, for example, when you look at how some of these major experiments in science have gone, with big failures resulting there as a result of people not informing the population in entirety on potential effects, on potential directions, and on potential wide-scale implications in regards to what it is that they may be talking about. Although you could consider this to be a sort of lesser extent here, this is still an entire way of life and multiple lives that you are affecting as a result of this one tiny statement that you forgot or maybe didn't want to, if we're going with the narrative that they wanted to fulfill a particular agenda here that you left out. It can't happen like that. It can't. So as I said, it's not like this is something that you can just, okay, Rosmersky was an assistant prosecutor, my bad. But yeah, this is not something that was going to just see every single person involved go unscathed at all. I've got to keep driving that point home. You're seeing Welker actively go through that, and it could take an even more drastic step if certain things go down on April 14th, and we'll definitely be looking into that. You have to at that point. But you have Welker in this situation, who, I mentioned Welker. What am I talking about? But yeah, she's like, it's not great at all for her at this point of time. Obviously, the prosecution as well, they are all in shambles. They're all in shambles. Because over this time, they'd be expected to have as much important evidence as they could possibly need in this situation right now. And they were still told essentially that it wasn't even remotely enough. In fact, with that major mistake being made initially, it offset everything else. And as a result, now this stuff doesn't hold up in court like you would expect it to. So again, you're left to try to play ball, and you can't get the justice that you were seeking for your victim in this situation. But then you get into the people involved. And to start out, I mean, you have to look no place further than Moore and his family. As this quote says from NBC Sports, Michael said she advised Moore to plead to no contest due to potential civil litigation and to help him move on with his family and avoid a trial. He has had the opportunity to be with his daughters, to be with his wife, to be home for the holidays, to take his kids to swim lessons, she said. As somebody who's come up the coaching tree and became a head coach at a young age, that is something that he has missed out on. I can tell you that losing his job and being at home, he has embraced it as an opportunity to reconnect with his family, to spend time with his kids, and to become the man he wants to be. End quote. When you put it that way, that's a hell of a perspective to look through in that situation. Because, while it might not be my place, with never being in a relationship before, you have to give his wife tremendous credit in this situation, I should say. You have to. And I was echoing this point at the time that you heard the original report. Yes, we've made the point that, again, some of this stuff in the long run might have been made out to be a little falsified, a little bit extreme, far too extreme for the court to buy upon first glance. To hear all of that, being his significant other, knowing now that even if you take all of that other stuff off the table, the second you hear that he's having an affair with one of his co-workers, your ears are already perked up and the alarm is already sounding off at a high level. Now you add in all that other wild ass context, and your heart is racing. You are perplexed in your mind, and in most cases you might not even have an idea of what your next move is. I'm thinking in that moment, initially covering it, like you could not blame his wife for just skipping out on this entire thing. Because at face value, that's a betrayal to everything that they'd been building. You have kids at home. You have me to take care of and be with, and you're spending time with a completely different individual. And potentially in a situation where you are risking your life and putting it in harm's way to make a point to derail this victim's life potentially. If a ton of questions were circulating her mind, you couldn't blame her about her even wanting to be around that anymore and having her kids exposed to that. Because again, to be with that, he in that initial report and that wave of reports was detailed that he'd been a family man. He built genuine connections with them, even though these articles that I'd read made several points to mention that it can be hard to establish that kind of relationship when you are doing that constant work of rising up the ranks so fast as a potential head coaching candidate in college football. That can naturally be difficult, but it's like he was wearing that hat and doing just fine. And you get yourself into that situation, that makes you look tremendously crazy and distrustful to your wife. And also, again, sets a little bit of a bad example for the very kids that you're trying to raise. All those were real things that could have been running through their minds right now. But in his wife's case, even in the heights of all that, she's right there. Like, I was reading somewhere else. Let me see if I can find this, because I know I saw this somewhere. Let me see. But yeah, and one of the things that I read, apparently, as everything was breaking down, he's getting a text, or sending the text out after his firing, in a complete blur. Naturally. Like, that had been everything you'd been working so hard for, and it might have thrown him over the edge. It could have been a potential last straw into a descent of madness, the way in which they wanted to, explain that he'd been dealing with a wave of mental health issues for some years. Right? His wife, apparently, according to one of these articles, saw that text and proceeded to try to reach out to him as much as she could. But of course, with the allegations in mind, that didn't end up happening as effectively. But it's crazy to see that and hear that, knowing all that we've come to find out at this point. Yes. As this quote from the Detroit News states, right, I figured. Okay. Moore's wife called 911 the day he was fired before his arrest out of fear he might harm himself. According to a recording of the emergency call obtained by the news, Moore had told her he'd been fired and was in crisis. His wife told the dispatcher, and she didn't know where he was, but still made it a point to try to see if everything was under control and fine. That says a lot in that situation. It would be very easy for her to just not give a fuck in that situation. Genuinely, at that point. But she's displayed that throughout all this time. Frankly, without even having to say a word publicly. Neither Moore nor his wife have really come out in the public eye and said much of anything throughout this entire time. In fact, they mentioned that really the only time that Sherrone Moore spoke in this was to enter the plea and also to shut down a potential interview after he walked out of the courthouse with his hand and his wife's hand conjoined together in unison as they walk out of the court. Okay, there are different ways when you think about how some of these things go. Things can be played up to appear rock solid on the surface. One can't completely discredit that in a situation like this. But those quotes are also very real in that it does allow you, if you are truly getting a second chance, it allows you to take some time back and truly reflect on whatever the hell was going on. And try to reconstruct that bond in its entirety. Because, when you have a relationship like that, if you have a case where at the slightest whim of a potential conflict, or at the slightest sense of any major situation like this, if that can serve as the breaking point and the key ingredient for a potential split, there are a lot of things to question about that. Did you really have a deeper relationship at all? Or are you truly in love with this individual? What exactly was in it for you that made it so worth it to where you could withstand all this? And in longer term relationships, where this stuff is common, I'm thinking toxic relationships and things like that, people probably have their own reasons for it. But you understand that a relationship of that magnitude is genuine. When you can go through something like that and still, no matter what, have everyone involved in that family by your side, that means a whole hell of a lot. And regardless of what you think about that being genuine on Moore and his wife's end or not, does wonders for him as a person to make sure that he's on straight, understanding that you have someone alongside you, holding you down through it all, and willing to defend you from whatever it is that might be going on. So, again, she has not really said a word in the public eye, and doesn't really have to, but I think that something like that is honestly a pretty cool point to mention in this overall case. Even though, of course, in the scale of, the sentencing and everything like that, it doesn't necessarily correlate. You've got to give her the credit, though. And then we get to Shiver. Because on her end, she's going to be affected just as greatly. Probably to the same kind of way and extent that Welker may be feeling, depending on the decision on April 14th. Because, again, as we've stated through some of these other quotes, doesn't mean that these things did not happen at all completely, and it doesn't mean that it did either. You just land somewhere in the middle with this, and you're hoping to move on as quickly as possible. There's nothing really stating that Shivers' side of things is illegitimate. And if this was something that she truly was experiencing, if this was truly something that she believes that other people like her were experiencing, it still deserves some looking into. But on her end, the team that she had surrounding her and the prosecution, they did not get enough information to really ensure that things would hold up in court. They did not do the greatest job of that. And it does her a disservice if her story is actually true in nature. With what we have now, and, unless, there are, other pieces of video evidence suggesting, some certain things could align. There isn't much to work with. And they perfectly, again, exploited that, ensured that they had the right counter, and did what they needed to do on their end as the defense to satisfy the requirements that the judge laid out in the last hearing. And did it well, without much of anything in terms of rejection there. To the point where even the prosecution had no real answer. They couldn't cross-testify, examine anything. You did not have that in your arsenal as a result of this. That, all that stuff, again, is still to be taken seriously, and it deserves all the attention, all the focus whenever stuff like that is proven to be true. That's not something you can play around with. But I don't know what would be next for Shiver. Because at this point, again, we mentioned she's already out of this job. Can she really trust working anywhere else? Especially when it deals to, university work. It's tough to think about. We haven't heard much from her either. And we don't, outside of the context of being in this relationship, we don't necessarily know much about her specifically as a person outside of it. This kind of job is probably something that she was starting to get adjusted to, maybe something she genuinely wanted to do for quite a while, as someone who I'm thinking is far younger at this point, probably early 20s. This could be something that you wanted to position yourself for, maybe for the rest of your life. Those aspirations are definitely going to fly high around that age. And she'd been in the position that she might have been looking for all her life. Also, probably one that could have been done just to get by in some places. That's how certain things can be in general life as it is. You're not always going to get the kind of job that you desire. So some people definitely find themselves in their situation. It's not a guarantee with her. But I just, that's stuff to consider all the time. And to potentially be dealing with that at the job, to where you feel insecure and unsafe, can definitely play with your emotions and mind. And again, if that stuff, as I said initially when it came to the breaking and entering, if that was found to be true, it's traumatizing. Because even as she, returns to her own place of residence, it will never be the same. If there was genuinely a case where Moore came in there, barged in, and threatened self-harm and her life as a result of the firing. There's just no way that you can erase some of that from your mind if it truly happened. So everybody, again, came into this with that kind of mindset. Like, no matter what the end result is, and even when we get into April 14th, no matter how this ends up going, this was a situation where, you are seeing in real time over the course of a few months just how greatly lives can change. Because even on the national level, if this case finds its resolution at that time, you still have to worry about media pressure surrounding the case. If you are her, there are just general pressures from that area that you may not be able to handle anymore as a result of this. Moore is still going to go through reputational hell to try to recapture what it was that he was doing with Michigan in the first place. Even with a resolution, I still can't sit here and guarantee to you that he will get another look, at least in a good few years. Like, it's still going to take some time to repair that. And, also, again, the family as well, this is still a work in progress. It's great to hear that he's being able to reconstruct that relationship, because I'm saying in that video, the first one, multiple times, that, man, something like that can truly haunt an entire generation. Talking about a family that can continue to eat away at them, to where they may not want to associate with somebody like that anymore, even with that being their own father, their own husband. Doesn't matter. They're repairing that, but it's still going to take some work. It is not going to be perfect, and it never is. But even to get to a reasonable percentage, it's not going to be an easy process. Because I'm sure that even with all of that in mind, his wife has probably already had some of these conversations and is probably still asking him at multiple points, what drove you to, even if these are allegations, what drove you to do this, engage in this affair, put your life on the line for this other individual? There's no way. What about what's going on here? What about me? Am I not doing enough? Am I not enough? Those are real questions that are going to continue to circulate. And it's going to take some time to find those answers out amongst themselves. So again, naturally, that is something that has to play out over time. This is not going to be easy. Everybody's got their own way of dealing with the aftermath of this. But even when you look at the people, it still may not chalk up to what it is that the university has to do. Because, again, some of those quotes from the initial statement that I mentioned from the Detroit News that came via her attorneys from Shiver herself. You can't abuse that power to exploit people. You can't continue to have conduct like this occurring in workplaces. Pressure of that kind shouldn't exist. And that silence that is continued to be enforced on people, it's just not something that is conducive to overall success and safety. And that's real shit. As this AP article would state, quote, "Today's plea by Sherrone Moore confirms the seriousness of that criminal misconduct, but this case is about far more than one terrifying incident," attorneys Andrew M. Stroth and Stephen A. Hart said. "It raises urgent and troubling questions about how a powerful figure within a major university athletic program was able to engage in years of inappropriate conduct toward a subordinate without meaningful intervention or oversight." End quote. And yeah, that's real shit. You hear about some of the other stuff that was going on with Michigan at the time. The fact that Domenico Grasso was an interim because the previous president got fired for an inappropriate relationship. Then you hear something about a different person in Michigan's athletic department having this years-long operation of just like inappropriate cyber activity when it came to searching up and acquiring different pictures of athletes across his different devices. I forgot. I think it was like, let me get this name right, because I'm like, yo, like when I read that shit, I'm like, what? Yeah, it's Matt Weiss, it looks like. Right, like, yeah, no, none of that. And then you think about how some of the other things have gone across college football, really, and even in the Big Ten when you think about it. More specifically, Jerry Sandusky at Penn State. And how I'd already referenced that when it came to how James Franklin still embattled dealing with trying to break that program out of that rut. And the stench that came along with that scandal. It's not something that can continue to fly. It just can't. And if it can, you should very much question the individual. If you thought that Sherrone Moore was doing this, okay. You thought that Mel Tucker was engaging with something even though it wasn't years long, okay. You felt the hunch that Jerry Sandusky was getting himself involved in this, okay. But especially in that case, and when you look at others like this, you have to look at the whole thing. Because the culture is fucked up. If you have a person continuing to serve in that role for years and years and years with none of that breaking into the news cycle, or at least just making enough waves to alert the people of what is going on. There's truly something wrong with that picture. It can't subside. Whether it be because of the success that different coaches may have with a particular program, the amount of money they may cost, the kinds of traits that they possess as a coach that may be valuable to a program. Some of that just convinces people to continue to hang on to people of clearly bad faith and bad character. At that point, if those are the driving forces as to why a person of that kind is staying on a team, then it's like you also have to take a look at that person and those people still employing them. And so, as I was reading this, I'm questioning the whole time because you heard about the Jenner and Block investigation that they're conducting separately on the university and its athletic department. And I'm thinking to myself, like, okay, at that point, like, is it still ongoing? Because, yes, there could be a resolution in this case. And that would be a great win, as I said, for Sherrone Moore. But I'm still thinking, like, are they still going to pursue this? Are they actively pursuing this right now? Because I can't imagine that they're done with it just yet. And as this USA Today article would states, quote, university investigations into Moore and the culture of the athletic department are ongoing, end quote. Now, to this point, I believe that the timeline was to try to get this conducted and completed before they get a new president, which I think is in May. So chances are, probably soon after we get a resolution to the case in civil court, we may get a resolution to the Jenner and Block investigation thereafter. Only time will tell. I can't necessarily guarantee that. But there's got to be more at play there. You know, they mentioned the name Ward Manuel several times, and I'm thinking to myself, yeah, like, you may have some dirt on you or something in this as well. Or your morals are just completely screwed up. Because to employ that constantly, and not just that, but again, other people across the athletic department in the school are still doing the same thing, you have to look at the higher levels at that point. Because is it like, are you just, let me just put it like this. It's one thing when, you know, they constantly say one bad apple can spoil the tree, right? It's one thing to just have that happen every once in a while, okay? When that is becoming a pattern for the kinds of people that you are hiring in your organization, what is truly running through that head of yours at that point? Maybe you might just be that kind of person to seemingly find yourself in a position where you have these toxic and misconduct inducing characters in your program repeatedly over and over and over again, like when is it going to stop? What is it going to take? I would hope that there is nothing like that going on, but at the same time, there's got to be a penalty somewhere. There's got to be some kind of implication on somebody somewhere, because this has got to stop. This has got to come to a close. Like, even when you look at Michigan State again, not just Mel Tucker, but also what the fuck was going on with Larry Nassar in the gymnastics squad and the women on that team and in the Olympics as well. You look at all that stuff and how that went on for years, unquestioned, unchecked. And it took, again, all of this going on during the hashtag Me Too movement for it to finally get traction and get that nigga out of there. Why put yourself in that position, especially if you are gaining knowledge that something like this is happening? Gotta be quicker to action. You've got to be willing. I don't care how loyal you want to be to a coach. You have to, in this situation, where we're now in an era where we're looking at a sort of symbiotic relationship between coaches and players and things like that. Man, if you feel that somebody is doing wrong, you've got to do whatever you can to protect not just the players, but the general student population. Instead of having these authoritative figures retain these positions, knowing that they are actively serving as a detriment to each and every single one of them. And in the worst cases, maybe a threat. It just cannot continue to happen. So we're going to see what goes down there. Now, in terms of the Moore case, let me see. Okay, the quote from the Detroit News and another outside source states that, quote, "It is virtually certain he will serve no jail time beyond which he already has when he was arrested," he added. "I'd expect very limited probation and perhaps only a fine. He will be able to expunge his record in a few years," end quote. So again, like I said, it's not a guarantee right now. But, if that doesn't happen, then there's still going to be an element of not just reconstructing Sherrone Moore the person. It's now reconstructing Sherrone Moore the public figure by expunging this record and also committing to community service, if that is the direction in which they take. But again, all that speculation for now. There's a lot to think about with this. And that's definitely represented by the length of this video. I mean, it was a lighter update here. It wasn't a wave of them overall. But the context matters. The overall impact that it can have on every single person involved, and maybe others that you don't always hear about, as I mentioned with Moore's wife, matters. So it's all to be taken into consideration, especially leading up to a potential decision on April 14th, as that is the hearing for sentencing. But for now, that will do it for this video. Peace.